Hi everyone, it's Jerry. On November 24th, 2012, Magnus Carlsen competed in a game against the world in the second Gran Chess Festival held in Mexico City, Mexico. For each of the moves, the world voted for one of three options that were selected by grandmaster players. And in this game, Carlsen on the white end kicked off with e4, and what was voted on was the Sicilian c5. After knight f3, d6, we're heading for an open Sicilian with d4, cd, knight d, knight f6, knight c3, and now a6, indicating the Najdorf, and on move 6, h3. What's also quite popular is bishop e3, and after e5, the knight will make use of that b3 square. However, with h3, white is intending on g4, bishop g2 ideas, and a rerouting of this knight to this f5 square. So that's exactly what we have. After e5, it's not the knight going to b3, but rather e2. Bishop e7, g4 expanding, and you'll note that this is a strong support point on f5. This knight is on its way there. Black castles, knight g3. Black gets some development in, connecting their knights, and after knight f5 is now in a position to just move this knight out of the way. And it's quite timely. This d pawn is now defended, and there's now pressure on this e4 point. Bishop g2, development, defensive e4, more development on the black side, and now castles. After b5, we have a3. This knight does not want to be kicked around, and so rook c8, half open file, very logical moves, and now f4, striking at this center, and has the potential to enter the black territory. After this knight moves, this pawn could be expanding, and that's exactly what we'd have. White establishing a pawn in the black position. So what follows is knight a4, which is a curious move to see because you do run the risk of, a messy looking pawn structure. But the idea here is to eliminate this knight on c3, which is better placed than this knight on c6. Okay, you could reason this knight is applying pressure to this pawn, but there's not really a way to put additional pressure on e4. And if you recognize the weakest point in the black position, the weakest square, d5, you really want to try and get rid of a knight that could potentially make use of it. So knight a4 addresses this idea, and although black has doubled a pawns, it now allows black to put pressure on this b pawn. And, well, we're not going to see this right away, but the potential to put pressure on the heart of this white queenside structure is there. And if pressure is placed on b2, it may prove to be quite uncomfortable for white to complete their queenside development. So first things first, we have some expansion, a lot of action actually on the Kingside, and a lot of structural changes within these next few moves, and most of which are all forced. After g5, knight d7, knight takes bishop, queen recaptures, and now f5. Hitting that bishop, it only has one choice. It reacts, counterattacking move, hitting the rook, and if the rook just bumps up to f2. And black has to be very careful right now because the main idea is to just rip open this kingside structure by making this pawn on g7 flinch, or in other words, trying to get in f6, which is often recognized as a giant thorn in one's position. So black does well to avoid this by playing f6, and now we have g6. A lot of tension going on with these last couple of moves between the pawns, and the decision here now by black is a great one because there's the option of taking the pawn and after the recapture working with this particular structure, or just playing h6. Now what was decided on was h6, and we'll see how this now turns out to be a great inconvenience to black because this pawn is just priceless. Controlling these two flight squares, it will always present black a problem for as long as there is one heavy piece on the board. There's the potential for back rank issues. And then we'll see that highlighted later on. But the other alternative, what was played was h6. The other alternative is to actually capture on g6. And at first, I thought that this would be a mistake, because what it now allows white to do, or so I thought, what it now allows white to do is play queen h5 and then make use of this h7 square. But black, fortunately, would be in time to meet that threat. After h takes g, what we could have, or what we should have, is rook f to d8, which is vacating f8 to meet a move such as queen h5 with knight f8. And black is there just in the nick of time to not only defend h7, but the other idea is that it's putting pressure on g6, and so things aren't now as clean for white. That's not to say that this is the best continuation, but just to highlight how black would be defending should queen h5 be played. The knight would make use of f8, defend against h7, and apply pressure to this pawn, which runs the risk of just falling. Not long off, we could be seeing this queen e8 move, and white is having to find some accurate moves to be defending against this. And in the meantime, there could still be mounting pressure against the white queen side. So we didn't have this, but this is a great turning point in the game, and that will often spring about when we have structural changes. So h6 was played. There is no potential now to get to that h7 square with the queen. So things now transition. Since the king side is locked, we're now transitioning to the queen side. So bishop e3 is played, just completing, getting more pieces involved. And the other idea that white maybe could have gone with is b3, taking note that all of these squares are just taken away from that light square bishop. And so the bishop will be kicked off of it after either an immediate capture or just going back right away. Let's say takes, the bishop kind of gets kicked around for a bunch of moves here. a4, bishop c6, and after b4, white will not be denied of getting to this nice diagonal, and development is really, really smooth. If, let's say, king h8 in anticipation of a queen playing to b3, we just have really smooth development. And the big thing here is that this pawn is still a liability, and these pawns are perfectly healthy and soon enough can be converted into a passed pawn. So that was another route white could have gone for as soon as h6 was played, to play b3, but we didn't have that. Instead it was bishop e3, knight c5, repositioning, rook d2. It only came there to meet that bishop threat when it played to that c4 square. So now it's functioning very well, placing pressure on d6. That rook gets involved to defend. Queen e1 so that these rooks can now double. Queen b7, and I was talking earlier about the rook maybe putting pressure on b2, but sure enough, we could also have that queen playing the role. White avoids this, not wanting to play a very passive move. Rook b1 is just not the way to go. It could always be, let's say, kicked away. There's not a convenient way to defend against b2. So the idea here is to put pressure on c6. And the big thing here is really all about activity. Queen takes b2 is played, in other words, because trying to hang on to, let's say, this pawn on d6 just runs into some trouble. I mean, black is on the defensive in a great way. What do you do after something like queen to f2, putting more pressure on the knight with still ideas of penetrating into this back rank of blacks? It's very, very difficult. Keep in mind that a move such as knight takes e is not available because of queen f3. What do you do about this pin? There's not a good solution. If d5, you can actually just take this knight. Again, taking advantage of this back rank, this would be the best choice for black at that point, to immediately play the queen back to e8. But after the smoke clears, white is clearly just up a minor piece. So we wouldn't have knight takes e at this point. The main idea, again, is not to just go and resort to a completely defensive position. I guess you could play queen c6, and after queen f2, the knight going backwards just to defend the pawn, but that's not really the way to play the game. So instead, opting for activity, grabbing on b2, and is just a step away from grabbing a3, and this pawn becomes passed. But there's some serious issues. Again, all really attributed to this pawn being so deep in the black position, controlling these flight squares. So rook takes d, rook takes d, rook takes d, and now queen to a3. This pawn is passed, and this queen is indirectly observing that rook on d6. Queen d2, renewing this idea of getting to the back rank. Knight d3, an interference move. There's a disconnect now between the queen and the rook. The queen is hitting the rook, and we have rook d7, an active, probably the most active square for that rook right now. Bishop b5 hits the rook, rook d5, and now knight to f4, hitting this rook. Rook c5 is a cute move, just interfering. Black just a moment ago played that knight to d3 move, interfering with the queen and rook's connection, and we have a similar thing going on right now. The rook is getting in the way of the queen coming back to maybe defend along this diagonal, and of course if rook takes, we're just going to have this mate. Once again, everything is highlighted as soon as one of the pieces is no longer around to watch over that 8th rank. White can simply exploit it. So after rook c5, we have rook e8, and there are alternatives here. There's many different choices for the rook, but with each of them, white is always slightly better, and if not winning. There's maybe some more resistance that could be put up, but what was chosen on this move 30 was rook to e8, and now this is really going to crumble very fast. What white could have played, what Magnus could have played, is an immediate c4, knowing that if, let's say, the bishop plays to d7, white can actually go ahead and grab it and allow a very appealing looking queen takes bishop with check, giving a fork to the king and rook. That could just be met with king h2, and there's no time to take the rook because we would just have check followed by mate in 1. So there is just a little bit of a long-winded variation here. After king h2, there's not much you could do about the rook being threatened, and also this idea of bringing the rook to maybe c7 or c8. If rook f8 is tried, rook c8, what to do about taking the rook and giving mate here, or just giving check first and then taking the rook. There's not much you can do. Knight g6, pawn takes knight. There's just a couple checks that could be thrown in here, and eventually the king is going to find a safe haven on this h5 square, and this idea of the back rank is still present. So what we do have, instead of this c4 move immediately, this is what could have been played successfully, but there is a certain degree of calculation involved, knowing that you can't avoid, let's say, that perpetual check. Instead of c4, we do have rook to c7, getting back on that 7th rank. Queen gives check, king h2, and now king to h8. There's not much that black can do right here. There's the idea with king h8 is just to get off of this diagonal so that it, when the queen, if the queen does land on that diagonal, it's not going to come with check. If, for example, instead of the king going in the corner, if we had the pawn just trying to promote, well, we snip the knight, pawn takes bishop, queen gives check, king in the corner, queen f7, what do you do about the pressure on g7? Not much to do. Rook g8, you just take the rook, and then you deliver mate in 2. So one other variation might be after this position, after king h2, queen a2, preventing, let's say, c2 from coming about, we could have queen to d6. That's not to say that this is the best move in this position, but just to highlight the strength of this pawn right here on g6. It's not just around to provide mate on the back rank, but there are tactics involved against the g7 point as well. If, for example, a3, just trying again to promote, this is the tactic that we would have: rook takes g, king takes g, queen c7, king back, the queen gives check, and now this bishop starts to play a role, and this will be leading to mate in a couple. So however you slice it, after queen a1, for sure, black is completely busted. So queen a1, king h2, the king gets off of this diagonal, and what follows is c4. This bishop is killed, and what black tries is just to advance the pawn. There's not much more that could be done. So Magnus grabs that bishop, queen b2, pawn grabs on a6, and, well, this guy's just a couple steps away, and there's just nothing to do for black at this point. What is tried is queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, knight e2, and after a calm rook c4, a2, and rook to a4, this pawn is lost, this pawn remains passed, and white is still up a piece. Black is dead. And at this point, the world ends up resigning to the world's #1, Magnus Carlsen. So that's all for this video. As always, I hope you got something out of it. Take care. Bye.